Ladies and gentlemen, I have an update on a system I've been building for a while now. It's been a bit. I've made multiple videos on this PlayStation 2 Fat model as I've worked to kind of upgrade and modernize it. This is something I've been doing for multiple systems, whether it's the Nintendo 64, the Dreamcast, the PS1. It's just something about being able to get an HDMI port to pull video directly from the chip and see what these systems are actually capable of now being compatible with a large high-def display. It's interesting to me. And for the PS2, when I started going down that rabbit hole, I realized there are quite a few replacement parts that make this system fit right in with current devices. So I said, you know what, let's go for it. Let's basically do as much as I can. And that did get to the point where I did indeed install an HDMI port into the system, as well as a few other things. And we're going to go over that today and the conclusion to my ultimate PlayStation 2 system. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new. First of all, if you missed it, again, I did multiple videos. One that kind of detailed the process of installing a Samsung SSD. I also had to change out the IDE plug on that network adapter and make it compatible with SATA devices. And that's how I was able to get the Samsung SSD inside of the system. There are a bunch of different things you can do with that. Some people put full 3.5-inch hard drives in there just for the overall storage, which the PS2 operated off of very slow IDE drives back then. So even like a modern SATA drive, and you can go to 2 terabyte, 4 terabyte or something to fit as many games on there as you want. It's a pretty good upgrade there. Also, the SSD is silent. So I figured, hey, I'm trying to make this thing really, really quiet. Let's go that route, which also brought me to another video that I did where I showed off the fan upgrade, where I put a Noctua fan on it, and then the system was basically silent. It was very, very difficult to even tell if it was on. If it wasn't for that LED on the front that you press and it goes from red to green, I would have no idea it had actually powered on at that time. However, there was still a situation I had which had to do with two things. One was the controller, which there's a third-party controller that I got that I did like. It's fine, but the idea of being able to use maybe a first-party controller from Sony, a later generation one with the PS2, was something I thought would be fun to have, and the video out solution. So what I was doing was using component out and then using a conversion box to then move it over to HDMI, which again was fine, but it lacked a lot of customization and really features that, say, a modern TV now would be able to take advantage of, and also be able to change up resolutions on the fly, aspect ratios and whatnot to find the best image possible, or one that I would be happy with. Which then brings us to a certain device that has gone through some scrutiny because of kind of the options that they have in place, and that's the Retro Gem from Pixel FX. Now, at first glance, it seems pretty straightforward. It's a board that works with multiple different systems, like the PS1, the Nintendo 64, the PS2 Slim, Fat, I think the Dreamcast, but when I heard that it would work for the PlayStation 2, that's the route I immediately was looking to take. But then I realized they have this thing called the Shiny Edition, which they had to put out a chart for it. And you know, in gaming, when there's a chart involved, it's going to be a lot of fun. But looking at the Shiny Edition, it supports 1080p and 1440p, as well as deinterlacer for weave and motion adaptive. Now, since using this, I will admit I have basically stuck now with 1080p and motion adaptive for the deinterlacer. So I am taking advantage of the Shiny Edition. It just seems odd that you need to get the Shiny Edition, which is a sizable price difference. So from what I'm seeing on their site now, $120 is like the standard model, the basic edition. Going up to Shiny then pushes up to $190 or a $70 difference for the PS2 Fat. Again, odd situation there that you have to kind of choose between the two. I'm not sure if there's a reasoning behind it when it comes to sourcing different parts that then go on that universal board, but it is kind of annoying to have to deal with that. 1080p, though, to me is worth it because I would be using it on a larger OLED display, for example, like the one back here. And that was my biggest thing, was to get the PS2 to a position where I can play from the system from far away with a wireless controller and have a pretty good image, and being compatible with a newer TV like this so that I could play off of the actual hardware while also taking advantage of things like an SSD for faster loading. Now, the install for this retro gem is, as you'd expect. I've done many of these installations for HDMI boards where you have to have a ribbon cable with multiple points run up against a chip or multiple chips inside of these systems. Now, I typically will just do drag solder and go across. This one was a little different because there are components in the way, kind of, and you sort of have to bend and move the cable over top of it. You can change it out to a lower profile crystal that you can buy online, but I was having a hard time sourcing that part correctly or even within any kind of reasonable time frame to have it shipped in. So I just opted to solder over top of it, and it wasn't the easiest one. I feel like if those pieces weren't there on the board, this would be pretty straightforward, and I would put it actually easier than the N64 and the Dreamcast. But because of that, it put some stress on the cable, and it was a bit more work. In fact, even after I got it back together, I noticed that there was sort of this, I guess, a weak connection, even kind of a bridge that was formed from the kind of the pressure that was mounting on it. So that I had to go back in and clean that up. But after I did all of that, it went together fine. I also set it up with the controller in mind, so you can use the shortcut keys on the controller, which is R1, L1, right on the D-pad, and then circle. And it brings up an entire menu that allows you to connect to Wi-Fi, update the firmware, and do all kinds of things to the image. Now, as I was getting the system back together, I realized something. The power supply is no longer compatible if you go the route of installing this retro gem, which led me to changing out the power supply for something called the PS2 PSU. And what this does is effectively move the large power supply outside of the PS2, all right? So it's a very tiny board, technically, that goes inside of it and then takes the rest of it and puts it in a box outside of the system. Kind of like, think of a laptop adapter. That's basically what we have then with your PS2. It's not a big deal because the PS2 Slim technically goes that route as well, one of the ways that they were able to shrink it down so much, but I don't really like the fact that I went from what's a fairly universal cable now, right? The Infinity or the Figure 8 cable that we use for basically everything with the Xbox Series and the PS5, so it's pretty easy to switch them out, to what's basically a barrel plug from a laptop that's fairly specialized. In fact, I had to go online to get the adapter because it's like a 12 volt, 5 amp. Not typical, especially with that barrel plug. So fortunately, it was on Amazon. It was easy to get, but it's not something you would have just kind of laying around maybe at a friend's house if you took it over there. There's also a lot of 3D printing on the back of this system now because the fan uses it, kind of a 3D bracket. The power supply uses a 3D bracket. So a lot of things got replaced on the back with cheaper plastics. This is what I'll say there. And the HDMI port on the back is unfortunately like the mini HDMI. I prefer a full-sized HDMI plug, and the only one I feel like I've done that went that route was for like the PlayStation 1 system, but I had to break off an entire port to make that happen. So I know that there are space constraints. That's just one unfortunate drawback when it comes to this is I'm using not only a barrel plug for the power supply, I'm also using a mini HDMI. So this system is basically traveling with those two cords if I have to take it anywhere. As for the controller, I opted to go with an 8BitDo retro wireless controller adapter, and this allows me to connect the PlayStation 4 DualShock controller, and I have so many of them laying around now because the PS4 has basically been retired in my house at this point, so I figured I'll get some use out of it, and I was pleasantly surprised with this thing. So I did update the firmware on it, at which time I synced up the PS4 controller, and the DualShock had like a little bit of a rumble to it when I did so, and it synced up very quickly every time after that when I pressing the PlayStation button. It was like a second or two. The rumble works great. The connection is solid. I mean, I was like 15 feet away, no problem at all. So that does eliminate one of the big drawbacks of the PS2, which is that you are tethered with a cable, something that I know the newer generation does not understand, but that's why a lot of people, you may say older people now who are playing games, and when they get the Super Nintendo out or they get the original PlayStation out, they might sit on the floor and play it. It's funny to think about that, but that's just kind of how we played games back then because, I'm not even kidding, the controller cable would not reach the couch. So with all of that said, the experience using this retro gem with the HDMI out is really, really good. I mean, it looks great. This is probably the best image you're going to get out of the PS2. We're bypassing all of the little things that the system may do to it on the way to that multi-out port. and you can play around with the resolutions, the scan lines, the de-interlacing settings. It even has the ability to attempt to apply HDR to the PS2 image, and I tried it. Not really for me, although it did at least make the colors a bit more vibrant on like my OLED display. I don't know, just it looked weird for the PS2. I tried it in God of War 2, and the capture device I have doesn't capture HDR anyway. It kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. Like, you could tell it was not at all supposed to be there. I don't know, it's kind of a cool feature, I guess, just sort of built in. There's also a bunch of presets that have kind of been tweaked and changed up over I guess the development of this board, and I assume that means that maybe more presets can be added through different updates over time, since it's able to connect to your wireless router completely on its own and receive information. So yeah, maybe we could see more and more people play these different games on the PS2, come up with settings. I would like to see them as like a game-by-game basis. I don't know how difficult that is to do exactly. Like, can it detect what game necessarily you're playing and then change things up there on the fly? Because the issue with the PS2, which I can show you a ton of gameplay here as we go through, is that each game can kind of put out its own weird setup for video, whether it can do widescreen but not progressive scan, or it can do like the 16:9 setup, but it does like this weird less than 480i resolution that is then moved to that, and then the adapter attempts to figure it out from there through de-interlacing, and it can be a nightmare based on which game you're playing. Something like Tekken 5, I mean, just benefits completely from progressive scan and then moving up to what this board can do for me, example at 1080p. And I ended up resting on just the standard 4:3 resolution. That's what a lot of PS2 games expect when you turn it on. And the picture just looked really, really clean, except for one thing, and it has to do with the interlacing issue, which, again, PS2 games, not all of them are progressive scan. Some of them are in the options where you can just go in and toggle between them. Others are kind of hidden, like Simpsons Hit and Run. You hold down X or cross and triangle when you're starting it up, and it will ask if you want to go to progressive scan. But if there is no option for it, the Retro Gem does what it can, but for example, when it's a fast-moving game like Jak and Daxter, the first one, you can see interlacing and like things kind of breaking up around the characters as you're swinging the camera around or just running around. It's kind of distracting, but that's just sort of where we are with these older systems. You can only get so much out of them since they were basically expecting you to play this on one of those old tube TVs 20 years ago. But overall, for what I'm trying to get out of this system, which is to be able to put it in the entertainment center, have it hooked up through HDMI, wireless controller, a good picture from original hardware with an SSD that will hold all of my games that are typically my go-tos, yeah, it's worked great. I'm actually very happy with what I have here now. The only other thing I'm considering doing is changing out the shell. So unfortunately, this system that I started originally with like, oh, I'll put an SSD in it, now it's gotten to this point, it's definitely beaten up. It's seen its time, just kind of, I'm sure, getting passed around a lot, getting beaten up, maybe stepped on, dropped. Things happen to systems all the time back in the day, but it has scratches and scuffs all over it. And as much as I would clean it and scrub it with brushes, it unfortunately just never looks good. So it's very functional right now, right? More so than most PS2s, but it unfortunately looks kind of beaten up. And maybe I'll get to a position where I can find a really clean stock plastic for it, like the plastics all around it, because I do like the idea of looking at it from the front. It looks like a stock PS2. I mean, the free McBoot memory card is just that, a memory card that plugs into the first slot even, and then the retro wireless controller adapter looks like a wireless adapter from back then. So you'd have to look around the back of the PS2 to know that it's been heavily modified, and I kind of like that look. If I went with a third-party plastic, maybe like a nice like a ghost gray kind of look, that translucent plastic, that'd be kind of fun, but I think just the sleeper stock look is the way to go. So maybe I'll hold out for a really clean looking original plastic setup that pops up on eBay or something. But let me know what you guys think about all of this down below. It took a bit to get all of it done, mostly because I had to wait for parts to come in, like the Retro Gem when I pre-ordered that took months to get to me. I even PS2, the power supply, that took a bit over a month just because they got hit with a ton of demand after the Retro Gem released, and it was basically required at that time. But I'm pretty happy with how all of this turned out, and it was a fun project from start to finish. And maybe I'll look around and try to do this with another system, so let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me tackle to build the ultimate system. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.